So how does the European Union affect the job market and inequality? One way of thinking about that is that on one level it doesn't particularly, because lots of the causes of the changes in inequality that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years, not only in the UK but in lots of other countries, have actually been about much broader things than just the European Union. So there's been technological change that has tended to computerize out some people in the middle of the working population. So, the bank clerk has vanished as a job. People at the very top of the income distribution have done very well because of kind of globalization. These trends are global trends, and they're not just in the European Union, so the same sort of patterns are being seen in Australia, in the United States. So in many ways, there's not an enormous amount that the European Union affects. What it does affect, I would say, is two things. One is immigration, of course. So there's certainly some evidence that where immigration has hurt workers in Britain, it tends to be at the very bottom of the income distribution. And if anything, people at the top of the income distribution have done quite well from immigration. And so if anything changes on that score, you might see fairly marginal, I would argue, but still some changes in the income distribution. And then the second thing, of course, is that the European Union has lots of regulations about labour markets, job market, that tends to focus on the lower paid workers, so protections of their rights. And that's kind of been an important aspect for workers in Britain.
Brexit means Brexit.
If Brexit means Brexit and we want to make a success of that, I think the one thing that the government will have to think carefully about is how you take those labour market protections that are currently in existence for workers and what you do with them when you leave the European Union. So one option, of course, is to just take those current rights and just transpose them into British law and continue with them. The alternative is, of course, to say, well, either we're going to make them stronger or we're going to make them weaker. Of course, if we're going to make them stronger, we could have already done that because the European Union doesn't stop us making even more protections. So the risk is that we go down the other route and we begin to lessen protection for workers. And those protections tend to be for those at the bottom of the income distribution. So the government will have to think carefully about the trade-offs involved there. Theresa May, when she became the Prime Minister, emphasised that she was kind of a one-nation Tory who wanted to protect working families. It seems unlikely, therefore, that the right answer is to remove protections for those at the bottom of the income distribution. One worry would be, of course, that if the economic consequences of Brexit play out in the way that people have predicted, perhaps one argument could be, well, we might need to remove some protections to make the labour market freer and more competitive. I think that's potentially a short-term idea with potentially long-term consequences. One area that's beginning to receive quite a bit of attention is what happens to our financial services industry. So the financial services industry have been really important in terms of income inequality over the last 20 years because, unsurprisingly, they're very much represented in the top 1% of the income distribution. If we fail to get passporting, so our financial services are unable to sell their services around the European Union, that potentially harms the people at the very top of the income distribution, and that will, of course, actually narrow inequality in Britain. Unfortunately, it will narrow it by reducing incomes in the economy as a whole, and that may not be kind of the solution that we want. So it will be important for the negotiators to think about how to get at least some passporting for our financial services. Lots of this sort of the analysis that was done before the referendum was very much about how much the average household would lose. Whether you believe those numbers or not, there's clearly going to be some cost, and the question is how big that cost is. But actually what's not really been done yet is a distributional analysis. So if it's £3,000 per household over the next 5 years, which households actually pay? Is it everyone paying £3,000, or is it some paying £10,000 and some paying nothing in terms of their losses? That's a really important question, of course, for the income distribution. So, one's worry is that some of the areas that actually voted quite strongly to leave may be some of the areas that are worst hit, particularly because they're the ones that are most involved in manufacturing trade, for example, that could get hit depending on our trade arrangements. So the devil in the detail, I think, will be where in the distribution of income the particular hits from Brexit come. And I don't think we have a good sense of that yet. So if I had one piece of advice for the negotiators and decision makers, it would be to not just think of the average effect of Brexit. Think of the distributional consequences across the income distribution. That suggests either that you negotiate with that in mind directly and actually try and get protections from the European Union for certain types of workers, or you make sure that in your domestic policy you take measures to alleviate the costs that are borne by certain workers and not others.